Preface of The Shrine of Death and Other Stories by Lady Dilke. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ben Tucker. The Shrine of Death and Other Stories by Lady Dilke. Preface. The fates which dog the heels of men through life and bring them to the gates of hell most often twist some trivial mistake of ours into the scourge they bear in their avenging hands. The weak are taken captive and sit in chains, resigned or repining. The strong make war and thereby grow stronger. For, out of circumstance, weakness and strength both breed their own increase. To these we say, learn silence, suffer, and withhold doubt, there shall be help of the Lord. To those, endure and fight, so at the last there shall be peace. There is no rest without toil, nor any victory, except to those who make them ready to battle. Of the force, the fortitude of a man, success or failure gives equal proof. To have an end, a purpose, an object pursued through all vicissitudes of fortune, through heart's anguish and shame, through humiliation and disaster and defeat. That is the great distinction, the supreme justification of a life. Thus, when in the sight of the unwise these ones seem to die, and their departure is taken for misery, the seer declares that they have their reward, and are sealed with the seal of a great redemption. End of preface. Section 1 of The Shrine of Death and Other Stories by Lady Dilke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. The Shrine of Death. Ah, life has many secrets. These were the first words that fell on the ears of a little girl baby, whose mother had just been brought to bed. As she grew up, she pondered their meaning, and before all things she desired to know the secrets of life. Thus, longing and brooding, she grew apart from other children, and her dreams were ever of how the secrets of life should be revealed to her. Now, when she was about 15 years of age, a famous witch passed through the town in which she dwelt, and the child heard much talk of her, and people said that her knowledge of all things was great, and that even as the past lay open before her, so there was nothing in the future that could be hidden from her. Then the child thought to herself, "This woman, if by any means I get speech of her, can, if she will, tell me all the secrets of life." Nor was it long after that, walking late in the evening with other and lesser children, along the ramparts on the east side of the town, she came to a corner of the wall, which lay in deep shadow, and out of the shadow there sprang a large black dog, baying loudly, and the children were terrified and fled, crying out, "It is the witch's dog!" And one, the least of all, fell in its terror, so the elder one tarried, and lifted it from the ground, and, as she comforted it, for it was shaken by its fall and the dog continued baying, the witch herself came out of the shadow and said, "Off with you, you little fools, and break my peace no more with your folly." And the little one ran for fear, but the elder girl stood still, and laying hold of the witch's mantle, she said, "Before I go, tell me, what are the secrets of life?" And the witch answered, "Marry death, fair child, and you will know." At the first, the saying of the witch fell like a stone in the girl's heart. But ere long her words, and the words which she had heard in the hour of her birth, filled all her thoughts. And when other girls jested or spoke of feasts and merriment, of happy love and all the joys of life, such talk seemed to her mere wind of idle tales. And the gossips who would have made a match for her schemed in vain, for she had but one desire, the desire to woo death, and learn the secrets of life. Often now she would seek the ramparts in late evening, hoping that in the shadows she might once more find the witch, and learn from her the way to her desire, but she found her not. Returning in the darkness, it so happened after one of these fruitless journeys that she passed under the walls of an ancient church, and looking up at the windows, she saw the flickering of a low, unsteady light upon the colored panes. And as she drew near to the door, and seeing it ajar, she pushed it open and entered, and passing between the mighty columns of the nave, she stepped aside to the spot whence the light proceeded. Having done so, she found herself standing in front of a great tomb, in one side of which were brazen gates, and beyond the gates a long flight of marble steps leading down to a vast hall or chapel below. And above the gates, in a silver lamp, was a light burning, and as the chains by which the lamp was suspended moved slightly in the draught from the open door of the church, the light which burnt in it flickered, and all the shadows around shifted so that nothing seemed still. And this constant recurrence of change was like the dance of phantoms in the air. And the girl, seeing the blackness, thought of the corner on the ramparts where she had met the witch, and almost she expected to see her and to hear her dog baying in the shadows. When she drew near, she found that the walls were loaded with sculpture, and the niches along the sides were filled with statues of the wise men of all time. But at the corners were 4 women whose heads were bowed, and whose hands were bound in chains. Then, looking at them as they sat thus, discrowned but majestic, the soul of the girl was filled with sorrow, and she fell weeping, and clasping her hands in her grief, she cast her eyes to heaven. As she did so, the lamp swayed a little forwards, and its rays touched with light a figure seated on the top of the monument. When the girl caught sight of this figure, she ceased weeping, and when she had withdrawn a step or two backwards, so as to get a fuller view, she fell upon her knees, and a gleam of wondrous expectation shone out of her face, for on the top of the tomb, robed and crowned, sat the image of death. And a great gladness and awe filled her soul, for she thought, "If I may but be found worthy to enter his portals, all the secrets of life will be mine." And laying her hands on the gates, she sought to open them, but they were locked. So after a little while she went sadly away. Each day from this time forth, when twilight fell, the girl returned to the church, and would there remain kneeling for many hours before the shrine of death. Nor could she by any means be drawn away from her purpose. Her mind was fixed on her desire, so that she became insensible to all else. And the whole town mocked her, and her own people held her for mad. So then at last they took her before a priest, and the priest, when he had talked with her a while, said, "Let her have her way. Let her pass a night within the shrine. On the morrow it may be that her wits will have returned to her." So a day was set, and they robed her in white as a bride, and in great state with youths bearing torches, and many maidens whose hands were full of flowers, she was brought through the city at nightfall to the church. And the gates of the shrine were opened, and as she passed within, the youths put out their torches, and the maidens threw their roses on the steps beneath her feet. When the gates closed upon her, she stood a while upon the upper steps, and so she waited until the last footfall had ceased to echo in the church, and she knew herself to be alone in the long-desired presence. Then, full of reverent longing and awe, she drew her veil about her, and as she did so she found a red rose that had caught in it, and striving to dislodge it, she brought it close to her face. And its perfume was very strong, and she saw as in a vision the rose garden of her mother's house, and the face of one who had wooed her there in the sun. But even as she stood irresolute, the baying of a hound in the distant street fell on her ears, and she remembered the words of the witch. "Marry death, fair child, if you would know the secrets of life." And casting the rose from her, she began to descend the steps. As she went down, she heard, as it were, the light pattering of feet behind her. But turning, when she came to the foot, to look, she found that this sound was only the echoing fall from step to step of the flowers which her long robes had drawn after her. And she heeded them not, for she was now within the shrine, and looking to the right hand and to the left, she saw long rows of tombs, each one hewn in marble, and covered with sculpture of wondrous beauty. All this, though, she saw dimly. The plainest thing to view was the long black shadow of her own form, cast before her by the light from the lamp above. And as she looked beyond the uttermost rim of shadow, she became aware of an awful shape, seated at a marble table, whereon lay an open book. Looking on this dread shape, she trembled, for she knew that she was in the presence of death. Then, seeing the book, her heart was uplifted within her, and stepping boldly forwards, she seated herself before it. And as she did so, it seemed to her that she heard a shiver from within the tombs. Now, when she came near, Death had raised his finger, and he pointed to the writing on the open page. But as she put her hands upon the book, the blood rushed back to her heart, for it was ice-cold, and again it seemed to her that something moved within the tombs. It was but for a minute. Then her courage returned, and she fixed her eyes eagerly upon the lines before her, and began to read. But the very letters were at first strange to her, and even when she knew them, she could by no means frame them into words, or make any sentence out of them, so that at the last she looked up in her wonderment to seek aid. But he, the terrible one, before whom she sat, again lifted his finger, and as he pointed to the page, a weight as of lead forced down her eyes upon the book. And now the letters shifted strangely, and when she thought to have seized a word or phrase, it would suddenly be gone. For if the text shone out plain for an instant, the strange shadows, moving with the movements of the silver lamp, would blot it again, as quickly from sight. At this, distraction filled her mind, and she heard her own breathing like sobs in the darkness, and fear choked her, for ever when she would have appealed for help, her eyes saw the same deadly menace, the same uplifted and threatening finger. Then glancing to left and right, a new horror took possession of her, for the lids of the tombs were yawning wide, and whenever her thoughts turned to flight, their awful tenants peered at her from above the edges, and they made as though they would have stayed her. Thus she sat till it was long past midnight, and her heart was sick within her, when again the distant baying of a hound reached her ears. But this sound, instead of giving her fresh courage, seemed to her but a bitter mockery, for she thought, "What shall the secrets of life profit me, if I must make my bed with death?" And she became mad with anger, and she cursed the counsels of the witch, and in her desperation, like a creature caught in the toils, she sprang from her seat and made towards the steps by which she had come. Ere she could reach them, all the dreadful dwellers in the tombs were before her, and she, seeing the way to life was barred forever, fell to the ground at their feet, and gave up her spirit in a great agony. Then each terrible one returned to his place, and the book which lay open before death closed with a noise as of thunder, and the light which burnt before his shrine went out, so that all was darkness. In the morning, when that company which had brought her came back to the church, they wondered much to see the lamp extinguished, and fetching a taper, some went down fearfully into the vault. There all was as it had ever been. Only the girl lay face downwards amongst the withered roses, and when they lifted her up they saw that she was dead, but her eyes were wide with horror. And so another tomb was hewn in marble, and she was laid with the rest. And when men tell the tale of her strange bridal, they say, "She had but the reward of her folly. God rest her soul." End of section 1. the Shrine of Death. Section 2 of The Shrine of Death and Other Stories by Lady Dilke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. The Silver Cage. A devil, who was flying through the air one summer's day, grew weary, and spying the roof of a house surrounded by green trees, he directed his course thither, and sat himself down to rest on it. As he sat there, he heard a sound more lovely than any music, and at first he was so entranced by its beauty that he never asked himself what it was, but by and by, growing curious, he drew nearer to the edge of the roof, and looked out into the garden below. There he saw a woman, sitting in the sun, and sewing a silken shift, and she had hung up her soul in a silver cage on the boughs of an acacia tree over her head. And as she sat and sewed, her soul sang to her, and the voice of her soul singing of love and of men made enchanting music in the garden. Then the devil was filled with longing to possess a soul having a voice so beautiful, and he set himself to scheme how he might make it his own. And looking into the heart of the woman, the devil saw his opportunity, for she had heard the same music from her soul for many years past, yet love had not come nigh her, and she was ready to think that her soul had deceived her. So when he saw this, the devil, taking upon himself the shape of a man, went down and knocked at the door of the garden. And the woman, rising and laying aside her work, listened and asked, "Who is there?" Then the devil made answer softly, "It is one who is fain to enter." And the woman, who was weary of waiting, said with a sigh, "Is it love?" But though her soul was still singing to her of his coming, there was no hope in her voice as she asked this, for she had ceased to expect him. So when the devil replied, "Love does not dwell in the hearts of men," she began to muse and thought, "Perhaps it is even so." Then the devil, seeing that he had begun his work, went away and left her to her thoughts. But on the next day he knocked again, and though she did not open to him, he noticed that she lingered near the gate. So every day he came back, and every day her lips were less ready with the name of love. And she lingered longer, listening to the devil's words. But whenever she would have given ear to his wooing, the voice of her soul was a reproach to her, till at last one day, when she heard the devil at the gate, she took up the silken shift she had been making for her marriage with love, and laid it on the cage. Then the voice of her soul was still, and when its sound was no longer in her ears, she, going down the garden path, heard the echo of her own footsteps, and knew that she was alone. Now, when she had asked, "Who is there?" and the devil had answered, "One who is fain to enter," she said no more, but opened the gate and bid him welcome. So the devil entered the garden, and took possession of the woman, and all that was hers. As they two went down the borders together, the roses were in bloom, and the sun shone brightly. Only there was no music in the garden, and at last the devil said to the woman, "Let me hear the voice of thy soul." So she lifted the silken shift from off the cage, and folded it, and laid it by, but her soul refused to sing. At this the devil reproached her, saying, "Shall not thy soul sing for me, since it is mine?" And all the voices outside the garden reproached her also, saying, "Thou thyself hast bidden this one to enter thy garden. All that thou hast is his. If thy soul sing not for him, it is thy sin." Then the woman wept sore, and by all means she would have persuaded her soul to sing, but she could not. And the devil was very angry, and chid her, saying, "This is thy wickedness." The life of the woman then became so grievous to her that she thought often of death, and would have embraced him, only he passed her by. And if indeed she had sinned in opening her gate to one who blasphemed, and said, "Love does not abide in the hearts of men," her punishment was greater than her sin, nor did any give her comfort. Her soul was always silent, though she prayed it with many prayers. And the voices outside grew every day louder in rebuke, crying, "Ah, the shameless one, whose soul sings not for him to whom she hath opened the gate." And the heart of the woman was sore vexed. And seeing that by no anguish of praying could she induce her soul to sing, she began to work in the garden, watching late and rising early till her strength had well nigh gone from her, and her heart sank. Yet though in all ways she strove to do the devil service, and in all things she obeyed him, he would not be satisfied, since in the one thing she failed, and her soul was always silent. Then in despair the woman went out and walked in the miry ways of the world, and she asked counsel of many, and some mocked, and some would have found their own advantage in her straits, and others cried, "Shame!" and bid her keep silence, so that she returned to the garden, convinced that the devil had spoken truth when he said, "Love does not abide in the hearts of men." But it now came to pass that one night late, when she was toiling as one without hope, the woman heard footsteps in the lane without, and one came who knocked at the gate and said, "It is I!" But the woman neither answered nor went. "For this," she thought, "is but one of those without come to mock me." Yet when the dews fell each night, she heard the same words at her gate, and she began to listen for them, and at last she believed and said, with a great sorrow in her heart, "It is thou." Now as she said this, she heard once more the voice of her soul singing, and she cried out and said, "Though he may not enter, yet my soul is glad because of him." And the devil, hearing her say this, was wroth, for the voice of her soul was now so low that its music reached her ears alone. And in his anger he said, "If I hear it not, neither shall thy soul make music for any other." And laying his hand upon the silver cage, he opened the door. Then the woman gave a great cry and fell down at his feet, and the devil, putting his hand into the cage to seize her soul, found that it had escaped. Thus, being at last cheated of his prey, he left the garden, and those without coming in found the woman dead. So they put on her the silken shift which she had made for her marriage with Love, and laid her under the acacia tree. And the gate of the garden was closed, and she was left to her rest. But her soul, lying in the bosom of Love, sings forever in the gardens of paradise. End of Section 2, The Silver Cage. Section 3 of The Shrine of Death and Other Stories by Lady Dilke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. The Physician's Wife. Late in life, a famous French physician took to wife the daughter of an early friend. The girl herself had not much to say to the matter. Being very young, her eyes were not yet open to the world, so she followed the will of her family, and went from north to enter her new home in the south without doubt or question. The physician, being wealthy, had wholly renounced the practice of his art, and had devoted himself for some years past to the study of certain problems concerning the origin of life, and in order the better to command his time, he had withdrawn himself to an ancient castle in the mountains of the moors, far away from the haunts of men. Thither he carried his young wife, and at first she was not ill-pleased to watch the wonders of his laboratory, and was ready, like a child, to do his errands. But gradually her gaiety forsook her, and her life grew irksome to her, nor could the disquiet of her spirit long escape the notice of him with whom she dwelt. Now, in the sight of this man, science, pursued for her own sake, was the one absolute good. And dwelling much with his own thoughts, he had come to be uplifted with zeal, believing that in truth science had yielded to him the deepest secrets of nature, and that he was thus marked out from all other men. So it came to pass that whilst he himself worshipped science as being the true principle and lamp of life, He demanded of all those who approached him the recognition in him that deity which, so to speak, should be revealed to them in his person. Nor could any gifts find grace with him, except such as might be brought to render service to that ideal by which his own mind was possessed, and in whose name he claimed allegiance from others. He deemed also that he saw all men and all things truly, since his passions being wholly drawn into the service of science, he looked upon them without love. Yet, in the number of those who were attracted to him by his fame, there were more sycophants than true disciples, and he knew it not. When the physician had taken the girl to wife, he had looked to have in her a handmaid apt to his purposes, for she was quick-witted, and when her fancy was caught by the new wonders which surrounded her in the castle, he praised himself for his discernment. And in the beginning, when her spirit became troubled, he was merciful with her, thinking she was but a child, and by his wonderful tongue he so charmed her ears that she believed the melancholy which arose in her to be sinful, fought with herself, striving to put the passion of her balked desires into the daily services demanded of her. Her nature was, however, too strong for her will, and her life became very bitter to her. In the end there arrived at the castle a new disciple, a youth whom the physician greeted with alluring words, seeing in him one who should devote himself to science for her own sake. But presently he saw that the youth loved the girl, his wife, and at this he was even less angered than amused, for he thought the passions of youth matters of small moment. Yet, now and again, he observed the two, and the girl felt that he watched them. She, however, by this, for she had lived some time under the roof of the physician, had grown to hate the falseness of her life, as fiercely as she had in earlier days chafed against its narrowness, and she asked, "Is it not better to die by any kind of truth than to live in a cheat?" But there was now bred in her the cowardice of the slave, so she gave no outward sign, though her rage and her anguish became greater with every day. Certain operations were now undertaken by the physician, in which he needed the constant help of all those whom he could command, and chiefly that of the girl, his wife, and of the youth whom he had received as his disciple. Nor, being bent on the fulfillment of his plans, would he take heed to all the passion and the pity with which the youth sought to draw the girl to him. She, too, being weary with toil beyond her strength, began to open her heart to him, for at first when she saw his love, the girl had set herself against it, saying, "Not for this will I seek freedom, but for myself, since men seek us for themselves alone, and in this they are all one." But now, in her hardest straits, the great love of the youth wrought with her, nor did he leave any means untried which might prevail with her. So it came to pass one day, when she had been slow to follow the physician's meaning, and he had chidden her sharply, and the anger of her heart had leapt to her lips, and she would have spoken, but again habit had been too strong for her, that he having left them, she, despairing of herself, dazed with long watching and sick with stifled passion, flung wide the windows of the laboratory, and looking out saw the sky gray with rain clouds. There was an echo of moaning winds in the pine forest on the hill, and below, mirrored in the still waters of the white marble basin in the court, the black columns of a row of ancient cypress trees trembled at the approach of the coming storm. The girl covered her eyes with her hands for a moment, and then stretched out her arms before her. At this movement the youth drew near to her, and, she turning her face, he saw the mute anguish of her eyes. Then, coming very close, he said in a hushed voice, "You do not know how I care for you." And the girl answered, "I do." And there was a great silence between them. As they stood thus, the east wind, driving from the sea, gathered strength, and seemed as if it would sweep all the rain clouds before it. But suddenly there came down from the mountains a mightier force, bearing in its breast the very spirit of the storm. Then, in mid-air, far overhead, the two winds met, and the clouds were caught between them, and became a black and awful thunderbolt, which hung for an instant, threatening the earth beneath. Now was heard a peal at which the walls trembled, and the shutters of every window closed violently, so that all the chambers in the castle were filled with darkness. In that moment the youth and the girl sought each other, and their lips met. Nor were they conscious of the storm that raged without, for in the soul of each there fell a great calm. It did not escape the penetration of the physician that there was now a secret understanding between his wife and the youth, his disciple, but he thought, "If she be a fool, naught can hinder it. I have shown her the source of all wisdom. If she be unworthy and seek foolishness, let her go. My house shall be well rid of her." And when, as the days went on, he felt that a will was more plainly growing within her which opposed his will, he sought in all ways, by harshness and sarcasm and insult, to drive her forth. Now, the girl, although she bitterly resented this, was cowed, even in her anger, by his tones, so great was her fear of him. And in her doubt she looked to the youth, who was her elder by some years, for counsel. But he, having followed his impulse and striving by all means to win the girl to him, was now afraid of his own work. So having neither the courage to bid her come out of her bondage, and see if they two could face the world together, nor yet the strength to abide in the service of the physician and share her burden, he was already casting about in his mind how he might leave her. One morning the youth rose full of this thought, and taking his gun as a pretext went out to spend the day upon the hills, hoping that in that solitude he might hit upon the easiest way. All the day he passed in much disquiet, planning now this thing, now that, but nothing seemed easy to him, and at sunset he took his way back to the castle in heavy discontent. As he came down the ravine which led out of the woods, the echo of a song from a band of olive-gatherers fell on his ear, and turning aside from his path he stood and watched them at their work. As he stood thus, half forgetting his perplexities, he heard the footstep of one behind him, and at the same time the voice of the physician saying, "Your luck on my land seems small, young friend." And as he said this, the elder man laughed so that the youth's ears tingled, and he remembered he had not so much as fired a single shot. Nor, in his confusion, could he do more than mutter some unintelligible excuse, at which the physician, having looked keenly at him for a moment, turned away. And in truth, needing him no longer in his work, the physician would now have been glad to see the youth depart from under his roof. The youth, at this, much shamed and angered, went on his road, resolved now at all risks to tell the girl that he would go. And presently, reaching the castle, he entered the armory, where, laying down his empty pouch and his gun upon the table, he began to pace the floor in heaviness and irritation of mind. To him there came ere long the girl, for she had been uneasy at his long absence, and seeing the moodiness of his brow, she approached him softly, and laid her hand on his arm. But he shook her off, and taking that courage from his momentary anger which he had lacked before, he told her briefly, without disguise, that it was his will that they, at least for the present, should meet no more. And as he marked the whiteness of her face and the bewildered terror of her eyes, he hardened himself, saying that before all on this earth his mother was sacred to him, and for her sake he would not abide there, nor could he face her with the girl at his side. All the blood in the girl's body at this ran backward to her heart, but she did not attempt to gainsay him. Only lifting his hand to her lips, she kissed the fingers which scarcely closed on hers, and her voice was lost in her weeping. So the youth turned and left her, determined on the instant to leave the castle also. When the door closed on him, she looked round her in amazement, as if from the walls there might come an answer to the horrible riddle of her life. And as she did so, her eyes fell on the pouch and the gun which the youth had laid on the table. Moving instinctively towards them, her foot slipped, for she walked as one in a dream, and as she stumbled she heard the sound of mocking laughter echoing through the window, and looking towards it, saw the distorted features of the physician convulsed with malicious merriment. Then the floodgates of her passion opened, and a murderous madness overspread her soul. So, snatching the gun from the place where the youth had laid it, she fired on her husband, and he fell. It was soon known that the physician was dead, and that he had died by his wife's hand, but it was agreed that his death should be held to have been by accident. All that had escaped the girl at the time, for she would have openly avowed her guilt, was set down as the ravings of one distraught by a terrible calamity, and she was carried back by her family to the north. Nor for a long while would they allow her to be seen by any, but as the years went on they relaxed their guard. Then the youth who had loved her would have married her, but she would not, and he, remembering the passion of her old affection for him, believed, in the vanity of his heart, that she thought herself unworthy to become his wife, seeing that the blood of him who had been her husband was on her hands. This, however, was not in her mind, but her trust in him had died that time when, having striven by all means to make himself necessary to her, he had flung her back to suffer alone. From that day her love had been bitter to her, and when he would have returned, her heart was shut against him. She had reached middle life when she suddenly manifested her intention of going back to the south, and of living thenceforth in the castle which she had inhabited with the physician. For a while those about her sought to combat this resolution, but in vain, and she went back alone, for their entreaties could not prevail with her to let any of her family accompany her, nor did she show any sorrow at parting from them. They all said, "She has never been the same since that day." Deep in her soul, however, there was a resentment against them, for they had all been as one when she had been given in marriage to the physician. Living through all her last years alone in the rooms in which she had worked, she thought much of him, till she came to see him in a light different to that in which she had conceived of him in her youth. And it seemed to her that though he must needs appear to those whom he sacrificed, one altogether steeped in selfishness, yet his very cruelty arose out of devotion to ends beyond the common aims of men. Then the iron entered into her soul, and she withdrew herself into a closer solitude and silence. And she began to ponder the calculations which had absorbed him. But her brain was now weakened and refused its service. At last, when long years had passed thus, death, in the mercy of God, came to her. They had watched by her through the night, and morning was dawning, when suddenly she raised herself with a great effort, crying out in a voice of anguish, "It will not come right!" And thus she passed away. By her own wish they buried her in a nameless grave, and men soon ceased to speak of her story. But not long ago another, whose life was also torture, came to the castle, and seeing the day dying away in stormy flashes of purple and gold behind the cypresses of the graveyard, entered there. And the tempest in the air spoke to the fury in her soul, so that in wrath and anger she took her way along the darkening paths. "Has any," she cried, "ever borne the like?" And as she said this, the gusty wind made answer. For suddenly parting the trailing branches of a cassia tree, it revealed a tall white cross of wood, bearing neither name nor date. But in the fading light she read the words, "Dites-moi un pater." And above and below she saw drops of agony or tears. Then this woman, awed by the presence of an anguish living beyond the grave, fell on her knees, and when she rose from her prayer, seeing at the foot of the cross a little blood-red flower, she plucked it, and putting it in her bosom, went silently away. End of Section 3, The Physician's Wife. Section 4 of The Shrine of Death and Other Stories by Lady Dilke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. A Vision of Learning. There was once a boy who was born to all the joys of the South, and day and night he was glad of his life, till in his dreams he had a vision of learning, even as she appeared to men in the lands of the far north. Ever after this he was aware of something wanting to him. At the first he scarcely knew whether it were so or no, but thenceforth with every hour his need became plainer, till it mastered him, and, turning his back upon the sun, he passed over mountains and rivers, and vast plains teeming with the life of cities, and nothing stayed him till he came to the northern sea. There he took ship, and crossed the narrow strait which divided the land in which he was born from that island shrouded in the western mists, where, as he had heard, learning held her court. When he landed, the ghostly wreaths of fog which hang forever about those coasts arose and embraced him. But though he felt their kisses on his lips, he was not dismayed, and pressed forward on his way till, after 2 days' journey, he saw, rising amidst the woods and waters, the towers and spires of that town wherein, as he believed, Learning herself abode. And the people of the town came out to meet him, and welcomed him, and when he entered within their gates, he marveled to see the beauty of their city, nor could he praise sufficiently the lordly ways and noble buildings which he beheld on every hand. But at the last he spoke and said, "In which of these places, I pray you, hath Learning herself her dwelling place?" Then all these people answered him as one man, "All these be her palaces, and we are all her servants, and dwell within her walls." And they conducted him within the portals of one of the fairest, and coming to an inner court they led him up many stairs, and opening the door of a little chamber, they bade him welcome once more, and left him. When he was alone he was surprised, for the chamber allotted to him seemed scarcely such as one should have been found within a fabric so splendid in outward seeming. And the staircase by which he had ascended thither had appeared to him very dark, and so narrow that two could not have stood abreast upon its steps. But, in his humility, he deemed it only fitting that one who as yet could scarcely claim to be the least among her servants should find no spacious lodging in the house of Learning. And as he thought these things, looking from his window he saw close opposite to him the gray and crumbling walls of an ancient chapel, pierced with windows of many-colored glass. And behind the windows he saw lights moving in the gathering darkness. And as he looked, he heard voices chanting. And he said with joy, "Lo, day by day every dweller within these walls lifts up his soul in the praise of the beauty of holiness. When holiness hath become my portion, and Learning herself hath looked upon me, then shall I have entered into my reward, and shall be as one new-born." So he became a student in that place. But when many days and months had passed, and he saw not Learning, nor even so much as the skirts of her clothing, a great doubt came upon him, which made his soul very heavy. After long silence, he spoke to the doctors and teachers and masters, and said, "Surely, sirs, Learning hath left you for a space. She hath gone upon a journey, or is holding her court in other lands." But the doctors and teachers and masters were angry at this, crying out, "What strange folly hath possessed you? By whom, then, are our words inspired? In whose name, too, we pray you, do we bear rule over this city? Shall a student who is yet a dweller but in the outer courts put questions to us?" And they said also, "When you have gotten to yourself all the knowledge of the schools, then may you look to enter her sanctuary." At this the student was abashed, and he thought, "In the days to be, when I have gotten the knowledge of the schools, I shall, perhaps as these have said, discover her sanctuary." This was in the summer. Now, though there was no heat in the summer, yet it was very close in the little court wherein the student had his chamber. Often in the evening he would walk in the dusk below his own windows, and on one evening he remained thus walking till it was well nigh dark. Just as he turned himself, thinking that he would go once more within, he heard on a sudden a voiceless shriek which filled the air with terror, and looking whence it had come, he saw, perched on the edge of the decaying battlements which encompassed the roof of the chapel, a bird, in shape like to the birds which were common in his own land. But never before had he heard one that cried in such a fashion, a note of warning, of fear, of agony. So, standing there white to the lips, for the hideous sound thus breaking upon the silence had shocked him, he watched and listened, thinking that if it should cry again, the bird might perhaps utter the low appeals, the idle chatter, and the laughter with which it had been wont to fill the dusk at springtide in the south. But the bird was silent, and presently, spreading its wings, soared far away. Then the student longed to follow it, and for a while he believed almost that it had bidden him to do so. But at this time the masters praised him, saying he had done well, so he remained. The summer drew to a close, and the woods lost their leaves, and the rain fell in torrents every day, so that the sky of that country, never very bright, had become an inky gray, and the waters without the walls of the city rose and flooded the adjacent meadows. The student could now no longer go forth beyond the gates, and there were but few dwelling in the inner court where was his chamber, so that when he looked out, all was empty and silent, and the windows had that eyeless aspect which gives a ghostly air to uninhabited houses. And sitting in his chamber he listened to the perpetual dripping from the eaves, and as the heavy raindrops fell, they seemed to smite him. For though he had now gotten to himself much of the knowledge of the schools, and the masters and teachers and doctors spoke fair things of him, yet he knew in himself that he was none the nearer to his purpose. Sometimes now in his weariness he would close his eyes, and for a little space it would be to him as though he trod once more the sunny slopes of his ancient home beyond the seas. And in the breeze the blossoms of the cistus floated as if they had taken wings to meet him in his joy. And all around him there arose the scent of thyme and of lavender and of cassia, and his nostrils pricked with the resinous odor of the dark pines. And he saw their slender columns standing black athwart the silver sky. But when, dreaming thus, he had almost forgotten the vision which had lured him to the north, the dull metallic echo of the raindrops falling from roof to gutter awoke him, and there was pain in his awaking. When the autumn was far drawn into winter, it so happened that, rousing himself from one of these fits of stupor, which had now grown common to him, the student went to his window, and looking up he counted, as he had often done before, the lines of a black network formed by the branches of a leafless tree, just where the sky was to be seen in a little cleft between the roof of the chapel and that of the court. As he gazed on this, the motionless empty gray of the rain clouds was stirred, as it were, by something moving, and slowly, on broad black wings, once more a bird this time of evil omen, came through the sky and settled down upon the branches. Then the student thought of that other bird, and half expected to hear again its cruel note. But this one remained silent, only it ruffled its black plumes and folded its wings. The movement which it made as it did so was like to that made by the doctors and teachers and masters, as they wrapped their robes about them and took their seats in a place of honor. And the student called to mind how many questions he had asked of them, and in vain. Yet it seemed to him as if this bird had a message for him, and knew, perhaps, more than they all of the vision which he had seen in the south. Then he began to be curious about the tree which it had chosen for its resting place, and in the wildness of his fancy he thought, "If I can but find the place in which that tree hath its root upon which this bird hath chosen her seat, it may be that I shall then discover the sanctuary of which all the doctors and masters and teachers have spoken." But whilst he was still looking on the bird, the snow began to fall, and in a little while both the bird and the tree were hidden from sight. it now became his chief thought how he might enter the court which lay on the farther side of the chapel, and from which he, like others of his age, had always been excluded. So he went down at night, for not even the snow which fell heavily could keep him from trying the adventure, and strove to find some way by which he might pass. But though he succeeded in opening a little iron gate hard by the door of the chapel, he was stopped at the end of the passage into which it led by another which he could by no means unfasten. Night after night did the student continue to essay this second gate, but the fastening was difficult, and there was no light in the sky by which he might have seen how to handle it. The snow, too, lay always on the ground, and the unaccustomed cold was very bitter to him. At last there came a great storm of wind, which cleared the sky, so that the moon then, in her full, showed forth all her splendor. And on that night the student, when he went down, found that he could open both the gates with ease. So he entered straightway into where there was a garden, only all things were covered with the snow, except where, the drift having been swept to one side by the great storm of wind, there was, as it were, a path before him leading into the shadow cast under the farther wall. Looking about, he saw that the garden, like the courts of the building within which he dwelt, was shut in on all sides by high walls, and seeing no issue he was daunted, when, on a sudden, the bells in an old tower on the farther side chimed with a solemn tolling sound, and there arose an echo of that sound from the other side of the wall, and looking again more steadfastly into the shadow, the student was aware of a little door in the wall, and hastening along the path and coming to it, he found it ajar, and pushing it open he stepped within, and knew that he was in a graveyard. The graves, of which there were many, were all open, and in each there sat men clothed in robes of black or of scarlet, which were strangely bright, trailing in the sheets of snow all dazzling with the moonbeams. They were holding with each other high dispute, and the sound of their voices in the frosty air fell on the ears of the student like the echo of passing bells. But he was full of his quest, and after a little pause, going up the nearest, he said, "Tell me, O master, where shall I find learning?" And he who sat in the grave shook his head, but he answered not, neither did he lift his eyes. Then the student went to the next and said, "Sir, tell me, have you seen learning?" And he likewise answered him not. Then the student turned to a third, and said with a great agony of praying, "Answer me, I beseech you, have they, the masters, teachers, and doctors of this city, have they seen learning?" At this, all the ghosts shrieked with laughter, crying out, "Neither to them, nor to us, nor to any that have ever abided in this city hath learning revealed herself." And the sound of their voices crying thus was as the knell of his soul. So the student, seeing at his feet an open grave in which no one sat, asked no more, but saying, "This is my place," he laid himself down in it. On the morrow, when he was missed, a great search was made for him, nor was it long before he was found. When they had found him, they upbraided him with his folly, but he replied, "You are all liars, and now I know you for such, for neither you nor those that went before you have at any time seen learning in this city. The dead have spoken, and have put you to shame." At this, all the doctors, teachers, and masters declared, "He is mad." So the student was bound hand and foot, and they carried him to a madhouse. And there, because he was very violent, they put chains on him, and the reproaches of his ravings were very terrible to hear, and by no means could the wrath of his tongue be appeased. For many years he remained in this state, but by chance there came a woman who felt great compassion and sorrow for those in suffering and in bonds. Frequently she visited the madhouse, and brought at the least some word of calm or look of pity to the afflicted. It was a long while before the keepers of the house would suffer her to speak of approaching the student, for they feared lest evil should befall her from his great violence. In the end, however, she persuaded them to take her to him, and they said to her, "Should he ask you if you be learning, then you will do well perhaps to humor his folly, and to make answer that it is even so, and that you indeed are she." So, bearing in mind their cautions, the woman entered the student's cell, and on the instant, even as the keepers of the house had foretold, he asked her if she were not indeed learning herself come to visit him. But she, seeing him so all distraught and well nigh dead for learning's sake, was filled with a yearning of grief, and forgetting all their cautions, she cried out, "God forbid, my poor lad, I am but love." And at these words the student began to weep bitterly. Then the woman, without speaking, took from her bosom a red rose, and put it in his fingers, and the student, taking it, made as though he would have carried it to his lips. As he did so, his chains rattled loudly, and lifting his skeleton arms to heaven, he seemed once more about to call down curses upon men. But the scent of the flower changed his purpose, and he turned his face to the wall in silence. Then the woman prayed that his chains might be taken off him, and before she left him she had prevailed, and this was done. But on the third day, when she returned to know how he did, she was told, "He is dead," nor could she learn the place of his burial. End of section 4, A Vision of Learning. Section 5 of The Shrine of Death and Other Stories by Lady Dilke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. The Black Veil. There is a village in Norway which stands in a plain near a lake, not far from the mountains, but far from the sea, and equally far from any city. In this isolated spot there once lived a couple of ill fame. They were evil to each other, and to all the world beside. He was the stronger of the two, so she suffered the most. And the more she suffered, the more her will to repay evil with evil grew within her, till at last one night she slew him. But she did not grow strong with her crime. She felt the shame of it. So even then, when she could say, "I am free," nothing seemed well within her, and a fear came on her lest the neighbors should know or should suspect her guilt. So he was buried, and she bemoaned him, and she bought for herself a veil of mourning, longer and thicker than common. This veil, which was cumbersome at first, grew day by day more cumbersome, until, when some months had passed, it was so long that it trailed behind her, and so heavy that it weighed her to the ground, and so thick that she could see neither the sun, nor the moon, nor any stars. And day by day her fears grew heavier, and her thoughts were ever, "How shall this my veil be shortened? How shall it be lightened? And how shall my eyes be cleared?" Some of the people then said, "It is her over-sorrow has angered the spirits of the mountain, that have sent this curse upon her." She herself looked towards the mountains, where afar off there dwelt a wise woman, and when the others said, "Go, ask counsel of the wise woman of the mountain," she went. It was a weary journey, but at last it was done, and she stood before the wise woman and said, "How shall this my veil be shortened? How shall this my veil, which is heavy, be made light? How shall this my veil, which obscures all things so that I see neither the sun, nor the moon, nor any star, be made clear to my sight?" Then the wise woman, after a pause, made answer, "Go, pray 3 times in the night on the grave of him who is no more. Go, pray 3 times in the night on the grave of him who is not here. Go, pray 3 times in the night on the grave of him who lies in the earth." With this answer she went heavily back to the village, and they met her eagerly and questioned her, but she made no reply, for she shrank from the task set to her. And she shut herself indoors and thought, "Peradventure, if I go not over the threshold, it will be a less weighty burden." But it was not so, and outside the neighbors watched, for they marveled more and more. At last, one night of thick blackness covered the sky, and the woman arose and said, "If I go forth now, none will see me. Here I can sit no longer." And she went forth and betook herself to the churchyard. But she was not alone, for the neighbors watched, and when they saw her go forth they followed her. And she heard them behind her, and turned in fear and anger, and saw that they pressed on her close. Then she made haste, and coming to the high gate in the wall of the churchyard, she entered quickly and made it fast, so that none should disturb her and play the spy. But she trembled with a great fear, and the darkness was so thick that it stifled the words on her lips. But at last they outside heard her pray, and they listened, and there was silence for a space. Silence till, with a great cry, she said, "Help me, O friends and neighbors! He drags me down! He holds it and draws me to him!" And they outside shook the gate, but within she had made it too fast for all their strength, and she said, "I cannot pray! He draws me! I'm going down into the earth!" And her voice grew fainter, and they shook the gate like madmen, and some strove to climb the wall, and when they paused for an instant to listen, all was still. When the day came, and the gates were broken, and they had come to the grave, they saw nothing. Then, with frenzied hands, they laid bare the earth, and they found nothing. And next they opened the very coffin itself. The dead man was there alone, but in his hand they found a piece of her black veil clutched fast within his fingers. End of Section 5, The Black Veil. Section 6, of The Shrine of Death and Other Stories, by Lady Dilke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. The Crimson Scarf. This is a very old story. It happened long ago, when the Moors were in Spain, and it seemed as if they would drive the Christians utterly from the land, or make them their slaves. There was a great Spanish noble at that time who had many sons and only one daughter. She was of a noble nature. From childhood, truth and honor were her companions, and it seemed as if she had been born to beauty and harmony of life. She was beloved of all her brothers, but of all her brothers she loved the youngest best. It was on his 16th birthday that she was carried off by the Moors, she and her brother and her betrothed. They had ridden forth in the morning without thought of fear, for were not all the Moor lords holding council together at the court of their ruler? And at midday, in the heat, they halted, and, dismounting, the maiden seated herself on the grass, hard by the road, and the youths, unbuckling their swords, lay down near her. Here they were surprised, nor could they offer any resistance. Their servants fled, and the very silken scarf which the girl had knotted at the hilt of her brother's sword in the dawn of that fatal day served to bind her hands. At the first, in the madness of her anger, fear visited her not. But when the dews fell, and the speed of their horses was slackened as they began to climb the slow ascent to the mountains, then her heart sank within her, for she felt the hands of the Moor heavy upon her, and she knew her fate. When the day broke into the upper chamber whither she had been carried in the night, the girl lifted herself on her hands and gazed at the Moor, who lay sleeping heavily beside her. And she saw that he was, in truth, such a man as report had spoken him, one who could set his foot upon the necks of men. And as she gazed, she thought of his great renown, and a strange curiosity arose in her, and a pride that he, into whose hands she had fallen, should be such a mighty one. But whilst she thought these things, the sun stole into the room, and its first rays lit the knot of the scarf which lay across the bed at her feet, and when she saw its crimson folds, she called herself dishonored and accursed, and creeping stealthily, she drew to her a sword which the Moor had cast upon the floor. But he had been aware of her movements, and had watched her lazily through his half-closed eyelids, for he thought, "She is but a toy, let her do as she lists." Still, had he scarcely time to stay the swing of the blade in her hands, nor even so, though he caught her by the wrist, could he make so quick, but that the point wounded him deeply in the cheek. At this he drew her close, and wringing the sword from her, took her throat in his hand, and the blood dripped from his wound on her bare shoulder, and his eyes fastened on hers, but she neither flinched nor trembled. Then the Moor laughed in his heart, for he said, "This girl is no toy." So the thought came to him that he would take her to wife, and that he would set her on high amongst his people, and that she should bear rule in his household. But the girl would not, for she thought, "Surely I shall one day find some door of escape, and the way to vengeance." For it seemed a little thing to her to live, unless by living she might compass the Moor's death. Meanwhile, he spoke fair words to her brother and to her betrothed, and they, who were weary of their prison, where they dwelt alone, swore friendship with him. Her father, however, had not forgotten her. He had gathered together all his friends and had set forth to deliver her. But the Moor was mightier and craftier than they, and his people brought him word of the coming of the Christian troops, and he lay in ambush for them, and surprised them, and their leaders were taken prisoners, and these also were carried into the fortress, and the Moor brought them to the other two, and left them together. Then he sent to them a messenger, one of his most trusted counselors, and offered them freedom, and peace, and amity, and a great many gifts if they would give him the girl to wife. And her brother and her betrothed said, "Let us do so." But her father, whose heart was sore, replied, "Before we answer your lord in this matter, let me speak with my daughter." Upon this, other messengers were sent to them, who led them, by many galleries and inner courts, into a hall of many-colored marbles in the most secret part of the fortress. And there, when the silken curtains were drawn apart before them, they saw the girl standing in the midst. She looked at them without any sign of gladness, and there was a great silence between them. Then her father put out his hand to her, but she drew back a step, and folding her arms she eyed him with set lips, for she knew their errand, and she knew that they were minded to give her to the Moor. From her father she turned herself to her brother, and from her brother to her betrothed, and their eyes fell. And the father said, "Daughter, could you return to us in honor? Would it be well with you? Would it be well for us that you should do so?" And after a pause she answered, "Since this is so, avenge me and let me die." Then her mother's brother, who was a priest, said, "Since the Moor will take her, let her wed the Moor." And her father said, "It must be so." And they all turned to go. But her brother would have kissed her. She, however, seeing as he drew near the glitter of arms at his side, hardened her heart and stretched out her hand and pointed to them, for she knew they were gifts of the Moor. And the boy colored, for he was ashamed before her, but he was angry and said, "What then would you have us do? Oh, my sister, would you even now give your hand to your betrothed?" And when her brother said this, the girl forgot her creed, and her country, and her kin, and the hate with which she hated her brother, and her father also was greater than all the love which she had borne them from her youth upwards. The Moor entertained the Christian nobles with a splendid courtesy, for he was a prince among his people, and 7 days they stayed with him, and on the 6th day he was wedded to the girl, and on the 7th he let them go, and they went from him loaded with many gifts, horses and armor, and silken stuffs of many colors. And the priest said, "It is well, there shall be peace in our borders, and it may be that the Lord Christ hath raised her up to be the Savior of this people." But the father answered never a word, and his heart was heavy. When the girl saw them go, she cursed them, and she turned to the Moor, and gave herself to him, and she loved him, and her lord was her servant. But his mother came and looked on her, and said, This Christian woman shall be the downfall of our house. There is blood upon her hands, even my son's blood, and that of her own kindred." And she struck her and spat on her. And the Moor was afraid, for he thought the girl did not lift her hand, but only said, "This is thy mother," and smiled with her lips. Yet he saw her eyes, and her eyes were as they had been that day in the upper chamber, when he made as though he would have strangled her. So he sent his mother away in secret, and brought her by night to his uncle's house, and his mother in her anger cursed him also. The Moor, however, thought little of her, and much of his wife, and day by day he loved her more and grew to her, so that when the time came that had been appointed with her father, in which she should visit her own people, and she refused to go, he rejoiced, for he thought that she had altogether given herself up to his great love, and that its constraining force so held her that her home and her kindred were to her as though they had never been. He might well think so, for the girl drew to her all the arts of the Moors, and learnt readily all that they could teach her, so that she became famous in the land. And her soul was drawn daily nearer to the soul of the Moor by the passion in her blood, so that when he seemed to yield obedience to her, he was in truth but obeying something of himself. So had he wrought himself into her by his constant presence and service. And his great strength seemed doubled, and he grew in power, and it was as if they two might rule the world, for in all the land he was second to none. So when the fire, which was always smouldering, blazed afresh, and a great war broke out, for the Christians in the north pressed hard upon the Moors, then he became the chief leader of his people's hosts. And her wit was found so cunning in all devices that he called her to his counsels, and her name became a reproach amongst her own people, and a shame in the house where she was born. Her brothers spoke of her with hissing, but her father was always silent, only his head was bowed. There was never now any peace in the land, and it seemed to the Christians as if this woman, who had been beloved beyond all in her father's house, had become a very devil and fiend of hell. She was never weary of plotting strife between them and the Moors, not stirring up futile feuds, for all her schemes tended to the complete overthrow of her own people and the triumph of the Moorish power throughout the land. Year by year she drew daily nearer to the full accomplishment of her purpose, and her husband worshipped her, and she gave him worship for worship, and no man wondered that he had taken her to wife. At last, however, it so happened that the Moor's own mother's brother fell into the hands of his enemies, and because he was known to have cruelly tortured and killed many who had become his prisoners, they refused all ransom for him, and they put out his eyes and cast him into prison. When the Moor heard this, he swore that unless they brought his uncle to him within 20 days, 20 Christian knights from amongst the prisoners in his hands should be put to death. But the Christians were mad with despair, and they killed the old man, and they set him on an ass, and they tied his hands behind him, and so they drove him into the Moor's camp. Then the wrath of the Moor knew no bounds, and he placed the dead body of his uncle on a throne of state, and brought to the foot of the throne the Christian knights by whose death his uncle's murder should be avenged. And amongst the first 10 he saw standing his wife's brother. So he said to his wife, "He is your brother. I have sworn friendship with him, for this let his life be given to him." But her brother, hearing the Moor's voice, lifted his head and saw his sister seated on high, robed in silver and white, and the jewels which were on her neck and arms shining in the sun. And he was sore with his wounds, and his pride was galled, and he reviled her. So when she spoke, she said, "I know him not. Let the dog die." And the other Christian knights reviled her also, and she saw them die. Not many days after, a great heaviness came upon her, and in a dream she saw her father's house, and it was a house of mourning. And in her dream she came to the gate and knocked, and prayed that she too might share their sorrow. But they put her away. Then she wept bitterly, and it seemed to her in her dream that her mother, who had died when she was a young child, stood up and said, "It is my little one that weeps. In God's name, let me go to her." So the mother came out to her, and she held in her hands a scarlet cloak, which she wrapped closely about her, and drew it over her head. But when it touched her lips, she felt that it was wet with blood. Then she woke with a great cry, and the Moor would have comforted her, but it seemed for a space as if she knew him not. Henceforth she feared sleep, for more and more frequently it brought visions of the days which she had put away from her, and they came always in the same fashion, in the beginning of her dream, alluring her with some lovely feature of that which had been dear to her as a maiden, but, in the end, changing into horror. At last, sleep forsook her, and the day and the night became as one to her. Then her speech became rare, and no man could know her thoughts. The Moor, who loved her exceedingly, suffered greatly, for he felt that her spirit strove with his, and by all means he would have constrained her, but the workings of her nature were too secret for him, and he could not penetrate her mind. Though he kept guard over her, he could not hold her, nor get any the nearer to her. But the watch which he kept on her troubled him, and his strength was diminished. Neither was his brain so clear in counsel, nor his hand so prompt in fight. So it came to pass that he who had seemed proof against all the weapons of men was brought back to her one day, grievously wounded. In his first anguish he had called on her name, nor had he fallen so low that any about him dared disobey his will. And they carried him back to her, and she tended him, because she had great skill in medicine. But he lay as one dead, for a great weakness had come over him when they brought him into her presence. So they carried him no farther than into the hall of many-colored marbles, where a bed was made, and there they laid him down with his armor at his side, just as they had taken it off him. When the bleeding from his wounds was staunched, they left him, and she sat near and watched. Now the night drew on, and the day dawned, and as she watched it seemed to her as if he slept, and something called to her to look on him. So she rose, and as she drew near to the bed, she put out her hand, and touched the hilt of his sword. And she took it up, and drew her finger along the edge. As she stood thus, she remembered her own people, and her father's house. At this the Moor sighed, and she saw that he had turned slightly towards her, and the light of the morning struck sharply on his left cheek, and there, where the light struck, she saw a purple scar which she had never marked before. But now it was made plain by his exceeding pallor, and she knew the scar of the wound which she had given him with his own sword that day in the upper chamber. When she saw this scar, it seemed to her but as yesterday that she had fallen into his hands, and it was to her as though she stood before him in the upper chamber, and her arm was lifted to strike. At this, in her heart, she cried on God, and said, "Surely this time, O Lord, thou hast delivered him into my hand." Then the Moor opened his eyes, and knew her purpose, and she struck him, and his blood was on her hands. After this, she stood still for a while, looking at him. And then she turned round, and as the light grew stronger, it seemed to her as if she saw her father, and all her brothers, and her betrothed, and the priest, her mother's brother, standing in the doorway, as they had stood when she had cried to them for vengeance. And pointing to the bed, she said aloud, "This should have been your work." And a vision of the upper chamber rose before her, and she thought, "They should have carried him there." And she left the hall, and lifting the silken curtains, she found the slaves asleep outside, and passing between them with a light foot, she took her way towards the stairs. There she paused a moment in doubt, but soon her memory grew clear, and she went straight forward and found the door, and it was open. So she entered and pulled it after her. Sitting then down upon the bed, she put up her hands to her face, and as she did so the jewels on her arms flashed in the morning sun, and she shrank back from them, and undid the clasps of her bracelets one by one, and laid them on the bed. But as she undid them, she called to mind many times and places, and when she put off the rings, which the Moor had placed on her fingers, she remembered the touch of his hands, and the pressure of his arms about her. Then a great crying to him arose within her, and the heart of the woman was like a soul torn by two devils. So did her deep love to the Moor fight in her Christian blood. For the two had so loved each other that not even the thought of the deed which she had done could come between them. She knew that, could he be called back, there would be no need for any pardon, since their love had grown to such a height that wrong could not exist in it. And it seemed to her as though they grieved together for that which it had been laid on her to do. She heard him say, "My life is thine, O my lady. Take my life, and throw my honor in the dust, if it seems well to thee. Stains shall be brighter than silver." And her agony grew, and outside the anguish in her heart, she heard the Christian tongues praising her as Jael and Judith, and their whisper was like the hiss of snakes in her ears. She thought, "Oh, my God, he was greater than any, he was stronger than any. I was but as a puny child to him. Yet I had my will of him, out of his great strength came his weakness." And she thought, "What am I without him? And who shall stay the hand of my enemies?" At this thought, the gray hairs of her father cried out to her, and in her despair she cast herself on the ground. And as she lay there, she stretched out her arms before her, and her fingers touched something silken. As she felt the silken knots, she saw her youngest brother standing before her, with his sword at his side, and the crimson scarf which she had bound about the hilt, and she remembered his death and knew that her father's house was no place for her. So she sat up and drew the scarf to her, and shook off the dust which had gathered on it, and played with it, and held it in the changing lights which came through the colored glass of the window lattice. Then, putting it to her lips, she said, "Ah, my love, would that I had died by thy hand that day." So saying, she sighed heavily, and twining the scarf about her neck, she drew the ends tightly with her clenched fingers, and falling forwards on her face, she died. When they found her, the day was long past, and the mother of the Moor bade them bring her dead body before her. And after she had gazed upon her a while, she said, "Her own house knows her not, neither is she one of us. Give her to the dogs." And she was given to the dogs. End of section 6, The Crimson Scarf. Section 7, of The Shrine of Death and Other Stories by Lady Dilke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. The Secret. There was an old town built on the two sides of a broad river, and on the bridge which spanned the river and united the two halves of this old town, there stood every day a little boy. He stood always on the upper side, looking to the north. Sometimes he looked beneath, and his eyes fell on the waters driving past him, eddying and curling in the piles below. And sometimes he lifted his eyes to the distant mountains. If any spoke to him, he had but one word for them. "Whence does the river come?" Then some laughed, and some said jestingly, "Whither does it go?" And some shook their heads and said, "The child is mad." They drove him to the school with the others, and he went, but still his thoughts were on the bridge, and thither he returned when the books were shut and the door closed. He grew older, yet no joys of youth, no glories of the sunset or the sunrise, no radiance of the south could win his eyes from the cold white light beyond the frozen mountains. And still on his lips there lay ever the same questions, though silence became a closer friend to him with age. Then, at last, he looked his question only, and one drew near and said, "Seek the bosom of the snow maiden. The secret is hers and hers alone." So visions of the snow maiden visited him in his dreams, and all the day was dull to him, and the night when he might see her, if but in sleep, became dear. And the mother who bore him watched him with a terrible foreboding, for said she, "My son's soul is lost to me, and his eyes see me not, and his spirit is gone forth, let God say whither. Then, after many months had passed, she missed him from his bed, and she sought for him on the bridge, nor was he there, nor was he anywhere. And bitterly she said, He is gone, the child of my womb. Nay, not one kiss hath he printed on these lips in token of farewell. And she covered her face. But the neighbors upbraided him for a vagabond. But the mother said, Good women, my son is no vagabond. It is the charm of the snow maiden that hath drawn him from me. Meanwhile he had gone on his way. The river was his companion and his guide, but the mountains were distant, and often the waters lay as if in sleep. Then his heart sank within him, for the cold light which told him of the far-off presence of the snow maiden seemed to be withdrawn into the recesses of the sky. And the river mirrored the trees and the fields, and even the habitations of men. Still he held on, and when sleep came, and the weariness of despair, then often was he visited by dreams. And the snow maiden stood before him and smiled, and he was lost in her beauty. In the morning he would arise after seeing such a vision, free from the stains of travel, unheeding the dangers of the way, and with all fatigue vanished from him. And as he drew nearer and nearer to the mountains, though his body grew weaker, and he was well nigh to death, then the visions which visited him in sleep were more radiant than before. Nay, each one seemed plainer and more evidently true, and he would wake, having tasted the breath of the snow maiden, and seen her loveliness in all its glory. Yet one thing was strange to him. Though she smiled on him, she saw him not, for her eyes were always closed. A great passion now woke in his heart, for he said, If I may not see her eyes, I had liefer die. And he cried now day and night on her name, for he had reached the mountains, and the rocks were hard to his feet, and his weary limbs would scarce bear him forward. Then one night, when the anguish of longing and despair had well nigh slain him, he saw before him a great cavern. He had sunk to the ground in the anguish of his crying, when he was aware of the black cavern before him, and was aware that she, the snow maiden, was there. She stood in the entrance, and he dragged himself on his knees to her, and she laid her arms about his neck, and he heard her voice. Art thou come? She said. Art thou come at last, O my love, for whom I have waited so long? And she drew him to her, and raised him in her snowy arms, and they entered the cave together. But he was like a man in a trance, and he uttered not one word. Then she wooed him with lovely sayings and signs, and he lay in her arms, and the pure snows of her embraces were upon him. But still he spoke not, and his eyes were as the eyes of one who sees not. But at last he lifted his face to hers, and he looked on the snow maiden, and her eyes were still closed, and all the agony of his longing came upon him, and he cried, O my love, if I see not thy eyes, what good shall my life do me? Open thy eyes, my love, open thy eyes, that their light may fill my soul. Then the snow maiden opened her eyes, and in that glance he knew all the ecstasy of love, and his soul fainted within him, and the sound of many waters was in his ears. Meanwhile the mother was desolate, but one day she ceased moaning, and said, Come with me, O good women, this day shall my son return to me. And they went with her, and they came to the bridge. And when they came to the bridge, the mother turned and led them by a steep path down to the water's edge. And lo, it was so. Her son had come back to her. The waters had brought him from the home of the snow maiden. She had taken his life, but he knew her secret, and the light of her eyes was in his. End of section 7, The Secret. Section 8 of The Shrine of Death and Other Stories by Lady Dilke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. The Serpent's Head. In a castle by the northern sea, 2 women, a girl and her mother, dwelt alone. Nor had they wished for friends and neighbors were there any to find in that desolate country. All the space which was not covered by water was spread with sand, for the hills near the coast, mined by the stealthy advances of the sea, were forever falling over and strewing the shore with ruin. The only feature of this mournful landscape was a black reef of rocks to the north, the position of which was marked, even at the highest tides, by a crag called the Serpent's Head. The castle itself, which was on an eminence, completely isolated from the surrounding country, showed but the scanty remains of its ancient glories. The great tower yet stood on the north, proudly intact within the inner series of fortifications, but facing it on the south and east were naught but ruins, whilst on the west a disused building called the Chamber on the Wall presented a gloomy and deserted aspect. Such life as yet lingered within a fortress meant to contain 1,000 men was apparently confined to the tower, and centered on the existence of 2 women. In a vast and vaulted chamber, the sides of which were riddled with strange closets and mantled with books, the mother constantly sat. But her gaze was more often on the deserted courts below than on the pages before her, and oftenest of all her eyes would seek the black reef on the north, and spy out the antics of her daughter, diving and swimming about the Serpent's Head. The girl in her childish days had been content, finding infinite amusement, as the fisher children did, in the wonders of the sands. In the hollows of the great drifts she had built for herself many a fairy chamber. But as she grew older, these sports were all outworn, and of all her delights one only remained to her, for she was a fearless swimmer, and to dive into the deep waters off the Serpent's Head was ever a pleasure to her. There, too, she would sit for hours gazing seawards. No tiniest speck of sail that crossed the waters could escape her watchful eyes, and as she watched, she dreamed that some day one of these distant sails should bear down towards her, and one should come in whose hand she would lay her own, and they too would flee to the far east. But as the changeless years went by and brought him not, the girl grew sullen, and a sense of wrong possessed her, for the older she grew, the clearer became her consciousness of a world beyond her, and the greater her longing to seek it. So the sea, with its journeying ships, appeared to her as the path of deliverance, and the way of escape, and the castle in which she dwelt was as a prison to her. And sometimes sudden fits of gusty passion would overtake her, for weariness grew to hate, and hate to wrath. And rising to her feet, she would clench and shake her impotent hands at the gray walls above her, frowning motionless at the ever-moving sea. Then her mother, if by chance she saw these demoniacal gestures, would smile a bitter smile, and when they met her eyes would have a challenge in them, so that the girl's passion, which the moment before had risen high with questioning, fell before her gaze. Nor did it ever seem possible to her to speak her thoughts, and there was never any confidence between them. Thus it was that the girl went always alone, and one morning in the late autumn, having risen from a bed fevered with evil dreams, she betook herself, as was her wont, to the Serpent's Head. It was low water, and stepping lightly from point to point, she soon reached the utmost projecting crag, and sat herself down upon it. Now, as she sat, she looked into the waters below, and her eyes fastened on 2 long ribbons of seaweed which floated out of a cave beneath, or were sucked back as the tide ebbed or flowed. As she looked on them, these ribbons of weed seemed to her like 2 long arms stretching and reaching out to her. Then suddenly she remembered her dream, for in her dream it had seemed to her that her own heart lay in her hands, and as she held it before her, lo! 2 arms had stretched themselves out of the darkness, and her heart lay no longer in her own hands, but in those of her mother, and she heard her mother's voice saying, "It is mine!" And a great anguish had come upon her as she felt her mother's fingers in her heartstrings, and she awoke. Now when the girl remembered her dream, the fever of the night ran yet in her veins, and she continued to watch the witch-like movements of the weeds upon the water, until it was as though she felt the clasp of their slimy tendrils, drawing her downwards. And yielding to a sudden impulse, she sprang to her feet, cast her garments from her, and hastily girding on a little blue gown which she had brought with her, she threw herself into the sea. Once she had touched the water, her dream faded, and she forgot her meaning to enter the cave below, and struck out from the land. Nor was it long before all the blackness in her heart vanished, and she began to laugh, joying and sporting in the boundless waters. But soon there arose a sea fog such as afflict those coasts, and in a moment the shore and the sea were as one, for on all sides the impenetrable mist had fallen. At this the girl made, as she thought, for the point whence she had come, and she did not discover that she had utterly lost her bearings till the sound of the signal, fired from the castle walls, rolled past her through the waves of shivering mist. She was now weary, but the sound was no sure guide, for having reached the shore she found herself still so far out of her course that her feet were in the quicksands which lay to the south of the Serpent's Head. Now anger and fear laid hold upon her, for the tide was coming in fast, and she knew that no man might land at that point with his life. So turning to the north, she struck out again for the rocks, and the old fever mounted to her brain, and she fancied that the hand of her mother lay heavy on her life. And the thought was, I will not die but live, I will be stronger than thou. And even when in her extremity the end seemed very close to her, the fog began to lift, and before her she saw the black shape of the Serpent's Head. Then with a desperate effort she drew near it, and the fog lifted altogether, and she saw that no other part of the reef was visible. But though she laid her hands upon it, the numbness of her body was such that she could get no footing, nor by any means could she raise herself on to the rock. There was one, however, who now watched her, one who had ridden from afar, and caught by the fog and the rising tide had tarried near the rocks. When this one saw the girl clinging to the Serpent's Head, he rode his horse a little way up the shore, till he could put him in the curve of the breakers. And thus, like one who had often done the same, he strove to reach her. But by this means he could not. So next, letting go his horse, he made himself ready, and fetching a wide circle he reached her, and brought her safely to land. When he touched the shore, he laid her on the sands and knelt beside her, and she, half conscious only, opening her eyes and seeing him thus close, made one of her dreams, and of her escape from death, and putting her arms about him, said, I have saved my heart, and it is yours. And she thrust her mouth to his, and she kissed him. After this she lay still as in a swoon, and he was amazed. But the girl was very beautiful, and great pity and tenderness possessed him as he saw her thus. Then he looked about for help, and so looking he espied a narrow path embedded in the grass-grown sand, and leading to the postern gate of the castle. Taking her then in his arms, he bore her slowly thither, for the way was steep, and pausing now and again he felt that the pressure of her arms about him tightened until she held him so close that when he had brought her into the presence of her mother, scarcely might her stiffened fingers be unclasped from about his neck. Now, when at last she opened her eyes, she lay in her own room, and her mother stood near, and she heard her mother say, Would God that she had perished in the sea! And she saw her mother's face, that it was very stern as she said this. But the heart of the girl was glad. She felt neither fear nor anger, and hate seemed harmless. So great a love within an hour past had leapt up within her. And though no word had passed, she knew that he who had fetched her from the sea was her lover, and that even as it was with her, so it was with him. Next day, and each day after, they met again by the Serpent's Head. But her mother watched her, and looking towards the rocks at sunset, she saw them together. Then neither that night nor the next did she take any rest, and on the morning of the second day, when the girl would have gone forth, her mother met her and said, I have somewhat to say unto you. And the girl, suspecting her purpose, stood still before her, and folding her arms across her breast, she answered, He is my lover, and shall be my husband. And the mother at this cried, Are you hot so soon? But I have that to tell you which shall put out your fires. There is a curse on you, even the curse of your accursed father and his race. O God, she continued, shall not one life suffice, and shall his seed drag yet another and another down into the abyss? Shall a son born of your body live to rivet these devil's chains on another life as fair as mine? And a great shiver passed over her, and she closed her eyes a space before she spoke again. And then it was in a different tone, a tone of pitiful pleading, that she said, Child, for the sake of your love, put him from you. Die sooner than bring this death to his soul. And in so saying she averted her eyes, for she knew that if she looked upon the girl and saw in her father's features, the dregs of hate grown cold would be as gall within her, and turn her words to bitter. So laying her hands on the hangings of the wall, her lips moved, silently as in prayer, and she went on as one in a trance. I gave my soul to him who was your father, and here for years I served him, but by no service could his spirit be appeased, and the hour came that I knew him to be mad, and he knew it also, but the world knew it not, and a great fear came upon him that I, who knew it, should betray him. Day and night he watched me, nor could I by any means elude his cunning, till at the last he had me at his will. Here her voice dropped, and her lips were white, as thrusting aside the folds, she pointed to the stains on the floor beneath. There, she said, is my blood. And letting go the curtains, she loosened her gown and showed a deep and ugly scar upon her breast, and even as she did so, a dagger, dislodged by her sudden action from among the weapons on the wall above, slipped from its holdings and fell between them with a terrible rattling sound. So she stooped, and picking it up, looked steadfastly upon it. It is the same, she said. Ah, God, that night and the long days that went before, and the long years that have followed after. Is there any mercy or any justice in heaven? But the girl put no faith in her, and the thoughts which had been in her mind that day when the fog had fallen on the waters returned to her, so that she gave no heed to threats or pleadings, and the anguish of the other soul moved her to scorn only and laughter. For the story of her house was as a fable to her, and when her mother called on her to stay the curse, and stretched out her hands in praying, she called to mind the witch-like moving weeds below the serpent's head, and she remembered her dream and how she had felt the fingers of her mother on her heart. Then, too, she remembered how she had been delivered in her need, and turning to go, she answered, I will not die, but live. I will be stronger than thou. But the mother said, Not so. Yet if you will do this deed, you shall first ask your father's blessing. And as she said this, she laughed, and the girl felt that her laughter was more to be dreaded than any threats. So now they two went forth, and crossing the court came to the broken flight of steps which led up to the chamber on the wall. When they had mounted these, they stood before an ancient door heavily bound with iron. Then the mother knocked, and was answered, and entered, and the girl, though she was stricken with fear, followed her in silence. But when she had come into the presence of her father, a great compassion filled her heart, and her eyes were drawn to the subtle appeal of his. Has she told you, he said, that I am mad? I am not mad, my little child, it is she. And here his voice took on an accent of infinite pathos. It is she who was once all the world to me, who has abandoned me and left me desolate. Ah, for God's sake, take me home. Come back to me, my wife. Give me love. Yet how should any love such as I am? And as he pleaded thus, turning from one to the other, the girl, seeing his chains, thought shame of her mother, and with reproach on her tongue she made to go forward as though she would have embraced him. But her words died on her lips, for looking on her mother's face she saw that it was as the face of one inspired. And even as she was about to advance towards him, her mother put her on one side, saying, Lord God, take my life if by this means it is thy will that this plague be stayed. She put herself within his reach, and kneeling down close to him, folded her arms on her breast. Then, before the girl was aware of his purpose, he had her mother in his grip. And before any aid could come near, she was dead. All that night long the girl watched alone by the body of her mother in the tower, and a great struggle went on in her mind as she began to see the meaning of her mother's act. And at daybreak the spell upon her was so strong that as she saw the gray light of dawn she rose, and falling on her knees beside the bed, she folded her arms on her breast, and it seemed as if she, too, were about to dedicate her life, so that the curse of her house might be stayed. But the chamber windows fronted the east, and even as she lifted her face to heaven, the first rays of the morning sun flushed the sky and caught the crests of the waves, and the path of light on the waters went by the serpent's head, and changed its black to gold. At this sight the girl started to her feet, and throwing wide the windows, "I will not die," she said. "Is there no other way?" Even as she asked this question, she answered it with another. "Why should my seed live?" And as she spoke thus, turning to leave the room, she saw her own face in the glass, and it was as the face of her father. Then her gaze became fixed, and presently she whispered to herself and smiled. And turning her back upon the corpse, she went swiftly to seek her lover on the rocks. Not long after this the father died, and the girl married her lover, and the castle, which had so long seemed like a vast and empty shell, overflowed with life. And all things prospered with her, only of all the children born to her not one lived. And many said it was best so, seeing that their inheritance, all fair to outward seeming, had so dark a spot within. But the husband was ill content, for most of all he desired a son that should bear his name, and his wife was angered at this, for she thought, "Why should not I be sufficient for him? What need has he of child or heir when I am near?" And her passion for him was spiced with jealousy, and when once more she became with child and saw the hope in his eyes, she set herself to cheat it. Nor by any means could she be persuaded to value rest, or to live in such wise as was deemed fitting. And now at dusk the hoofs of her horses would be heard in mad gallop along the causeway, or at early dawn she would be seen battling with the crested waters off the Serpent's Head. Between her and her husband there were high words, and he reproached her, and swore that there was purpose in her folly. Then she caught him and held him, crying, "Why should this devil's brat come between us? You are all the world to me. Am I less to you?" And she would have kissed him, but there was that in her passion which filled him with loathing, and thrusting her from him, he said, "Are you mad?" After he had said this, he repented himself, but she answered him nothing, only her face blanched. And from this day forward she was very gentle, nor did she cross his will in any way, nor even once did she return to the Serpent's Head, only sitting in the tower chamber there, where her mother had so often sat before her, she watched the waves beating on the rocks. And her husband, wishing to feel her mind, said, "The day will come when you will be there again." And she smiled as she answered, "Aye, the day will come." Yet though she was so gentle, he felt that there was wrong between them, and when the child was born his great joy was poisoned by fear lest it should displease her, and he watched to see if there should be any change in her manner or in her look. But he could find none, till one day he, having taken the child in his arms, looked up suddenly, and thought he saw a gleam of malice in her eyes. Yet this faded into smiles so swiftly that after, when he recalled her look, he misdoubted that which he had seen. Shortly after this, she and her child were missed from the castle, and it was late evening, so fearing he knew not what, the husband looked from the windows to the rocks, and there he descried her, seated on the Serpent's Head with her little one on her knee. The tide was coming in fast, and dumb with anguish and horror, he made haste to reach the shore. But the way seemed long to him, and even when he drew near to her, he scarce dared to approach her, for his fears shaped themselves as he ran. and became one agony of terror for his child's life. And he thought, "If I come upon her unawares, she may cast him into the sea." But she, though her back was turned to him, was aware of his coming, and she rose to her feet and faced him, still holding her child in her arms, whilst he, waiting, and often slipping and stumbling, made his way slowly to her. And as he drew close, he saw that she wore the little blue gown in which she was wont to bathe, and her golden hair was loose about her neck, as when he had seen her first, and her feet were bare, and a smile was on her face as she kissed the child in her arms, as if it were very dear. And then calling and moaning out to him, she cried, "My mother's hand is heavy on me. Oh, my love, save me! Her hand is heavy on the child, and her arms are stretching from the waves to seize us. Ah, my love, save us!" And now he had almost laid his hands upon her, when she, thrusting the little one from her, shrieked, "Take your devil's brat! I will have none of it!" And he saw that his child was dead. At this he made as though he would have seized her, but before he could lay hands on her she had him by the throat. Nor could any strength of his avail to unloose her fingers. As he struggled with her thus, he felt the crag rock beneath his feet, and between his teeth he cursed the day that had brought him thither to mix his blood with that of her demon blood. But neither to curse nor to pray could then avail him. The tide came on, nor was there any help from land or sea, and the great waves leapt high above them, and her fingers tightened on him, and her lips clung to his mouth, so that gasping for breath he stamped in his fury with his foot. Then was the great crag loosened utterly from its hold. For a moment it hung above the abyss below. Next, with a steady roll and a sound as of thunder, it plunged into the seething waters. In the gathering night a cloud of spray arose to heaven. Then the waves rolled on to the shore. And neither in ebb nor flow can any man find where the serpent's head has made the grave of its ghastly burden. But the plague of that house was stayed in the land. End of Section 8, The Serpent's Head. Section 9 of The Shrine of Death and Other Stories by Lady Dilke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. The Voyage. In a shining garden by the sea, a fair woman sat desolate, since he whom she loved must needs obey a summons, bidding him to a distant journey. And she thought, "How shall I bind his soul to mine, so that he shall come back to me, even as he goes, mine, body and soul?" For these two loved each other exceedingly, so that no mortal power could have prevailed to separate them. But the woman living constantly by the sea knew its witchery, and she feared the magic of the waves and the marvels of the great deep. Even as these fears came thick about her, she heard the footstep of her love. And looking up, she saw his shadow lying black athwart the sandy path between the great aloes of the entrance-way. So, rising, she went to a little swing gate set in a thicket of pink roses, and opened it, and let him in. Then, lifting her eyes to his, she saw that the hour had come. The man was moved, and the woman, clasping her arms about him, put her lips to his lips, saying, "Go, and bring back to me my kiss." And he answered her, and said, "Dear, thou knowest no human power can part my soul from thine." So the man took ship and went down to the great waters, bearing sorrow in his heart. Now, as he journeyed out into the deep, and utterly lost sight of land, his past fell away from him, and the charm of the sea and the sky was upon him and grew, so that it seemed, before many days were past, as if he knew no other country. The earth herself had become to his sight but a rolling ball of waters, flying ever beyond the sun, as the clouds closed and fell with every falling day. And as he forgot his past, so did he gradually lose thought for the future, till at the last it was so, that should any have come to him and said, "This is henceforth thy world, this ship on its far journey holds thy fortunes, and beneath its spreading sails shalt thou abide till night closes on thy life," he would not greatly have marveled at so strange a tale. Night by night, the voyager watched the stars of heaven, and learned the times of their rising, and knew them by their names. Often, too, he sat in the very path of the moon, till the rippling waves of her light flooded his soul with a silver calm. And at these times he withdrew himself from the ship's company, and would willingly be alone. For it seemed to him as if voices of delight were upon the waters in the night watches, only when men spoke with him, their loveliness faded away. Thus, watching and listening, it came to pass that one night, about the rising of the Pleiads, and whilst the cross yet was lying far beneath the waters, a voice fell on his ears, which enthralled him and brought a strange joy to his heart. A joy not unmixed with pain, for it waked echoes of remembrance, and he recalled that beloved one's voice, the tones of which had been dear to him in the garden by the sea, and he saw her standing silent in her sorrow and looking out beyond the roses, beyond the pale green belt of guardian aloes to where the blue and radiant waters washed the silver sands. Then 2 voices began to plead with his spirit, and hearing as it were in a dream the voice of his love entreating with that other voice of strange music, the man strove with himself and cried out upon her, and sought to have a yet clearer vision of her beauty, but in vain. The echo of her tones grew faint. The voice of mystery filled his ears, and even as he strained his eyes, thinking to see her very face, a fair mist, born of the sea, arose and veiled his sight. As soon as the early dawn had driven all clouds from the face of the morning sky, the man came to himself. But he was very moody, and this moodiness increased upon him throughout his journey. And he lived through the day watching only for the sunset, when there sprang up a light breeze, and with it the expectation that in the night watches he should once more hear the voice of music, and shroud himself with the mantle of the fair mist. And when he received letters from the woman, whom he loved at the port for which he was bound, the tale they told had no meaning for him, and he made haste to go again on board. Not that he had any desire or longing to the garden wherein she sat, but rather that he felt haste and impatience to dream once more his dream upon the waters. Now, when 7 times 7 days had passed since that hour in which she had gone forth, saying, "Dear, thou knowest that no mortal power can part my soul from thine," the man found that they were almost within sight of land, and the captain said, "Before daybreak tomorrow we shall cast anchor, and ere noon shall we be all on shore." Then great joy filled the hearts of that ship's company because of their return, but the man had no part in it, for his soul was sick because of the voices of the sea. Night drew in on that day with a great darkness, and the stars were hidden from sight, and the man, sitting in his accustomed place, strove eagerly to catch, if it were but the echo of a whisper. Yet he heard nothing. Fear came on him, lest the voices had departed. Great longing grew within him, and he was almost beside himself with pain when, about the 3rd watch of the night, the mysterious music once more filled his ears, and the fair mist herself at the last became visible to him. And the man, seeing the light of her eyes, gave up his soul in an ecstasy of wonder, and her kisses lay upon his mouth, and he was utterly possessed of her. Yet on the morrow, as his feet touched the land, the man remembered his love. But there was a strangeness in that recollection, as of something which he would but could not wholly bring to mind, and he turned himself about, as one but half awake, before he took the pathway by the blue waters which led to the garden. And as he walked under the aloe hedge by which it was defended, he was aware of a fair white canopy, fringed with silver, and raised aloft on 4 crimson standards, which showed plain above the thicket of roses wherein he had left his love. and he gazed curiously on the canopy as on something unexpected and unknown, and he made haste to the entrance portals, and passing in found the little swing gate open, and so, pushing through the roses, came to where this strange thing was, and having come to the canopy, he saw beneath it a bier covered with violets and asphodel and roses, and anemones of white and scarlet, and beneath the flowers he saw the dead face of the fair woman whom he had loved. Speaking to those that stood near, the man said, "Who hath done this?" And those who stood near answered, "Our Lady sickened and faded not many days after thy departure, and yester even, about the 3rd watch of the night, she died." Then the man knew that he had slain his love, and turning from the bier, he took the pathway by the blue waters, and entering into the black shadow of the pine woods by the rocks, he was lost to sight. End of Section 9, The Voyage. End of The Shrine of Death and Other Stories by Lady Dilke.